On today's episode, we ask, why buy drawer pulls when you can make your own?
Hi, I'm Will, and welcome back to the Woodpine Woodworks channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about making your own drawer pulls. So why buy them when you can make them? And the reason I made these at all, and they actually go on these cabinets here, is because the 1980s called and asked me for all their brass hardware back. And that's great, because I said, sure, you can have this. So today's video is all about making some pulls and showing you the process that I use to do that.
So we start with some design decisions and really ask the question, how big should these pulls be? So I spent a few minutes taking a drawer out, looking at it, measuring it, and trying to decide how big or how wide should an individual pull be. I went through a couple iterations, drank a little bit of coffee, and ultimately decided on a 5-inch wide pull. That seemed about right, fit my hand, and it was good. The next step is to select a piece of wood to make the pulls out of. And so to do that, I went into my stash of wood and I found a nice little piece of white oak. At this point, we have to answer the question, how many pulls can we make out of this piece of wood? So check it out, kind of give it a look, do some measurements, and ultimately try to figure out how many pulls we can get from this board. After some careful maths, I decided I could get 8 pulls per piece, or a total of 16. I often find it helpful to use a Sharpie and kind of mark up the wood, especially in its rough state, just so you have an idea of what all you have. And I use an X to identify scrap. This board has some pretty big bow in it, so I decided to cut it in half to minimize the amount of material I'd have to remove when jointing. So this just shows how I kind of mark things out and try to figure out where I could cut the board in half to minimize the bow. And drew a few lines, finally decided where I want to cut it, and don't have a chop saw, so I ended up using the table saw to do this and just chop it in half. It was at this point that I had a plan and kind of an idea where we wanted to go, so we moved over to the milling process. So I used the joiner to get one flat face first, just taking my time, taking nice light passes, getting this down flat, and then I ended up planing the boards off camera so that we could get to some nice square stock to use to begin to work on our pulls. And I can't overstate this enough, taking the time up front to mill your boards correctly to get nice square edges and parallel faces is really important, and it makes a huge difference later on in the project. So take your time up front to do this so you kind of set yourself up for success as you go forward. All right, now we're getting into the business of actually making the pulls. So we got a nice square stock, and we need to kind of sketch out what we'd like to achieve here. Here I'm trying to hold the camera and sketch at the same time, so it's a little wobbly, but I know I want a space to put my fingers, so I have to hog out some material so my fingers can get back behind it. And I know I don't want any kind of sharp edges or corners on this. And these pulls are very utilitarian, pretty simple, nothing fancy. But this is the place where I would spend time sketching them out, kind of trying some different things, maybe a couple different versions, and getting to that place where you're happy with the design. Here I'm sketching a line where the screw is going to go. So thinking about how am I going to fasten these things to the drawer, and what do I want it to look like ultimately. So I use the wood as a blank canvas, kind of sketch things out and give myself an idea of what I want to achieve. And do this as many times as you need to. Now that you have a plan and a sketch, we got to go figure out what we can actually achieve. So at this point, I walk over to my router table and I get out my router bits, and I usually set them out on the table just to start to see, what do I have, what profiles do I have, what do I have to work with. And I think about how I can start combining these profiles on the different bits to build up to the overall profile of the pull that I'd like to make. And with just a couple of bits, a round over and a cove, you can make some pretty amazing things. So here's just an example of some of the bits that I use. And again, the pulls that we made in this video today are meant to be simple and utilitarian, nothing fancy, but you can do lots with just a few bits. I ended up having a pretty big bowl and tray bit that I used for this, just because it could hog out a fair amount of material pretty quick, and it also had a radius that I liked. So it's at this point that we fire up the router table, and I'm going to start just by taking some shallow passes, again using the bowl and tray bit, and kind of sneaking up on my lines, checking periodically to make sure that I've taken off as much material as I care to. Because remember, it's easy to take it off, but much more difficult to put it back on. So here's where it pays to just take your time, sneak up on the profile that you're looking for, and just take many few shallow passes as opposed to trying to just hog it all off at once. You'll get better results and less of a chance of you getting injured for this. So here's a close-up of the beginnings of the profile. Then I end up taking a few more passes to make it deeper. I have a picture of that in a moment. There's a final depth right there after, I think that was about 3 passes. So after I route the recess for the finger pulls, I wanted to ease the edges of the rest of the pull, and that's where I reach for my roundover bit. And so I'm going to end up just routing small roundovers on any place that your finger might come in contact with. I don't want to bust my fingers when I'm opening up drawers, so I figured this would be a kind of a quick and easy way to do this, to soften these edges. And here's a couple of close-up shots of how that looks and how I oriented the board. Again, just going nice and slow, raising up that router bit nice and slowly. So now that we have the pulls fully routed out, we have to rip the blanks apart. And we cut the pieces this way because it's safer to work with a bigger piece of stock and then cut off smaller pieces after the fact, as opposed to trying to run a small kind of tedious piece through the router table, something that might be hard to support or to balance. You want to keep your fingers well away from that. So here I'm just ripping the blanks in pieces so that we can have our pulls nice and separated at this time. And now that we have everything ripped apart, we're going to start cross-cutting the pulls to their final width. That's that 5 inches we decided on in the very beginning. So here I'm squaring up the end of every board, and then I'm getting ready to cut out the 5-inch long sections. So I mark one piece at 5 inches, I align that on my miter gauge, and then I just clamp a scrap piece of wood to act as a stop block, a positive stop, so that I can just make a whole bunch of repeatable cuts. So you line up the first one, make sure it's good, clamp down your block, and then rinse and repeat. In this case, I think it was 16 times. I made 16 individual pulls. This gives great results, and it allows you to really kind of take the guesswork out of this so you don't have to measure every individual piece. And if all goes well, when you're done, you'll have a set of identical pieces to continue on with your work. All right, so everything's cross-cut to width, and at this point we're going to drill some pilot holes in the poles so that when we put the screws in them, we don't blow them apart. So I mark one piece, and then I just set up a quick little jig on the drill press itself with some quick clamps, line up the first piece, and then just start drilling. This process goes really quick, and if I'm going to do one piece, I might just measure it, maybe even 2 pieces. If I'm going to do 3 or 4 or 10 or 20, I'll take the time to set up a quick jig. This is just scrap wood, some quick clamps, and making sure that each piece is registered the same every single time. And then you just put some tunes on and go. And so this is a great way to batch out a little piece of work here and make sure you have nice consistent results. After all the holes are drilled, I had to move on to finishing, and I chose Danish oil because it's really easy to apply and it gets great results. So that was a quick step. Now that the finish is cured, and it's time to move on to installation. So I made a quick jig to make sure that I drill holes in the face of the drawers the same on every single drawer. Because I have 12 drawers to do it, it made sense again to make another little jig. So here I just pop in 2 holes in every single drawer, and they get placed in the same orientation on every drawer. And rinse and repeat that across all of them. And then I went ahead and countersunk the back of each hole so that the screw heads don't protrude into the drawer. And I just pretty much always countersink holes anyway, so this was just an easy step to do. When installing the screws, I like to use beeswax. I just find that it helps make everything go together easier, and it also reduces any chance of having blowout in these pulls because you don't want them to split on you. So I always had a good result with beeswax. I start the screws so they stick out just a little bit, and that helps me orient the pull itself, and then I can snug it up nice and tight. Well, that's it. thanks for watching. I hope you picked up a couple of tips and tricks, and hopefully you'll take the chance to make pulls the next time you have the occasion. Here's a couple more pics of the before and after shots. So again, this fantastic brass hardware from the 80s, and then something a little bit more modern and sleek. And so I'm sure these drawers will serve me well for many more years to come. So as always, thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next video.